We were looking at Iran the other day in photographs from the 1970s. Girls had mini skirts. They all look really hot. The guys had no shirts on, with six packs, walking down the street. Everyone's smiling. Looks like Europe. It looks like you're in Italy. And now it's a religious-run country. Just like it went that way in Iran, it could go that way in the United States.
For a long time, Iran was ruled by an oppressive monarchy that was propped up by different countries throughout history. Even though people advocate for it now, the monarchy was actually pretty hated. So much so that people protested against it and it collapsed, and then it was brought back again by the US. Any images you see from that period about Iran before the Islamic Revolution are actually less than 1% of the population. It was only the top of the top that was allowed to go study in the West and get educated there and live there and just come to Iran for fun or to maintain their businesses. The Iranian monarchy's corruption was actually a really well-reported phenomenon. There are reports of them bathing in baths of wine. There's a party they set up in 1970 that would celebrate 2,500 years of the Persian monarchy, and they spent around 200 to 300 million. They flew in, elites from all over the world and set up this whole city in the middle of nowhere in the desert just to make this celebration. All the while, most people in Iran could not read or write. On the surface, Iran looked like a modern, secular country, but in reality, that was only for a very small segment of the population, and most people had this sort of pre-modern quality of life. Most leaders and policymakers in the West were actually kind of aware of the situation. Even Nixon called the Shah the policeman of the Gulf. They knew he was not a great guy, and he was definitely not bringing Iran to greatness or anything, but he was good for them. They had access to Iran's oil, and that's kind of what mattered. And during that period when the government or the monarchy fell, Iran had this small experiment with democracy where they had their own prime minister who's democratically elected. In fact, the first democratically elected prime minister, he was Time Magazine's Person of the Year for 1950. His name was Mohammad Mossadegh. He actually had legitimacy by his people, although his policies were not very well liked by the West, especially the fact that he decided to nationalize Iran's oil. And then after that, everything goes wild. The British, they decide to impose a naval blockade on Iran, freeze Iranian assets. It's basically like a total embargo by most Western states. When Iran's economy is in shambles, and even though he's still popular, Iran's economy is not doing well at all. A couple years after the blockade, Iran is kind of still standing. They're a lot weaker, but they still have their own government. So the US and UK decide to start this joint operation, and they decide to remove Mohammad Mossadegh from leadership. So the CIA starts working, and they're doing this from two angles. First one is bribing military officers so they could orchestrate a coup. And the second one is paying newspapers and hiring people to orchestrate protests so that people might be able to, bring the government down themselves. And it works. Mossadegh is arrested and he's tried for treason, and then he goes to jail and is placed under house arrest until his death. The US and UK bring the Shah back in, the monarchy is back, oil operations are back to normal. This point is very central to Iranian consciousness, and it's central to the revolution that would happen later. It's kind of like China's century of humiliation. It's very present in the public mind. And this is kind of what kickstarts the revolution in 1979. The Shah, people are fed up with him. They protested against him before he fell. And then, a foreign government brought him back in. And, he's a lot more paranoid the second time he's back. He's cracking down on people more. He's more oppressive because he's afraid it would happen again. So despite all that, in 1979, protests erupt again. The streets are full, people are angry, and the army that kept the Shah in power is actually starting to fracture. It's a lot weaker than ever. American funding is drying up. The UK is not as relevant as before, and it's not looking good for the Shah. So he decides to flee Iran. The US doesn't actually help him. The only country that decided to take him in was Egypt, which is where he lived and died in exile, stateless, no passport, no family, no wealth. So that was the end of his life. So now we go back to Khomeini, who is still chilling in France. He's making his cassettes, he's talking to people, and he's kind of a unifying figure. Iran, under the revolution, had many different factions. They had socialists that supported the old prime minister. They had Islamists that wanted religious people in power. They had a lot of factions, but eventually this guy was really popular and he was seen as a unifying figure, grantedly not by everybody, but by enough people to make him relevant. So he's back in Iran. And this is where all his studying when he was younger is actually useful, because there were two main problems being encountered here that he needed to solve, and solve fast. First one is actually a religious question. If you don't know about Shia theology, it is a branch of Islam that dictates that political leadership needs to be maintained by Muhammad's family and descendants. This is unlike Sunni Islam, like that of Saudi Arabia, which doesn't dictate political leadership to be related to Muhammad at all. But the big problem with Shia Islam is they used to maintain this chain of who should be next in line that's related to Muhammad. But the big problem is the guy that was supposed to be next in line to be the leader actually kind of went up and left, or he disappeared. Nobody really knows what happened to him, but it was a huge problem because the entirety of Shia theology is based on the fact that there is a line of succession that's clear and unbroken. And that was no longer the case. The guy's gone and nobody really knows what to do. And the main belief in Shia Islam is that he went into something called occultation. He's not dead, but he's not here, and he will be back in the end times. This is great and all, but it opens a major problem, which is we don't know who should be next in line. And for a long time, that was a big problem for Shia Islam because they lost that legitimacy that they had for any kind of political leadership. And this is where Khomeini comes back in with his new theology called Vilayat-e-Faqih, which establishes that even though we don't have the guy that should be next in line, we can just pick the guy that's most knowledgeable in religion and can guide us the best until that guy comes. So he already has an answer for one of the most important questions in the last 1,000 years of Iranian history or of Shia Islam history. The next big question is, how do we make sure the Shah doesn't come back again? Because we already tried a revolution and he keeps coming back. Whatever we do, foreign governments keep bringing this guy back. And his answer is to establish a parallel military to make sure that the original military does not coup any elected government. So the main military, or the civil military, was called the Artesh, and this still exists. So he decided to establish this parallel military called the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. With this, he establishes a balance of power between the real military, or the main military, and a military that makes sure that the revolution stays intact and its original goals are achieved. And like I told you, this guy was pretty popular and he had a lot of connections with many different scholars and clerics that were also influential in their own right, and he made sure to use that to his best advantage. So he recruited all these people and he created a pretty large structure. The IRGC controls a pretty big chunk of the Iranian economy. Many professors, many politicians, many businessmen are also affiliates of the IRGC. They start also establishing offshoot branches of the IRGC, like Besiege, which is an organization that is more street level and is kind of a parallel to the regular police. And by this point, the IRGC is pretty powerful, and Khomeini is already in power. He established a new government with a new structure, and at this point he dies. But because he established this system that is surrounded by people who have the same education as him and is meant to continue even if the main guy gets killed or dies, they just pick the next leader and they move on. And the next leader was Khomeini, which is the guy that got killed a couple weeks ago. And when that happened, the IRGC, the same guys that picked Khomeini, just picked the next guy and they kept going. So the moral of the story is killing an 85-year-old guy to replace him with his son doesn't really do anything because it's just the same institutions. I don't know if there's anything more to the story, but yeah, that's pretty much it.